All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you in the West Coast. Welcome to our program today called Keeping Your Nonprofit's Budget Afloat and Adaptive in a Sea of Unknowns, a special joint webinar between the Nonprofit Advisory Board and FAR, formerly known as the Finance and Administration Roundtable. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, managing partner of the Tenenbaum Law Group based in Washington, D.C. I will be the moderator for today's program. We have four outstanding panelists who I will introduce in a moment for our program today, which I'm very excited about. But to kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to Donna Schifferle, who is the Executive Director of FAR, to say a few welcome remarks. Donna?
Well, thanks, Jeff. And again, good to see you and good to see all of our panelists. This is going to prove to be a very, very interesting conversation, I know. For those of you who are not familiar with FAR, we, as Jeff mentioned, formerly known as the Finance and Administration Roundtable, and we've been serving the since 1983 as DC's area's only association dedicated exclusively to nonprofit and association business leaders, welcoming them to a very robust community where professionals can gather, network, and expand their professional growth through engaging education, idea exchange, and valuable resources, just like this webinar that we are collaborating and partnering with the Nonprofit Advisory Board. So we are thrilled to be able to do this with all of you today and are looking forward to a great, great webinar. So Jeff, I'm going to pass it back to you. In fact, I'm going to turn my camera off and mute myself and let all of you get to the science of it.
Thank you, Donna. Thanks again for FAR's co-sponsorship of today's program. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers today, and apologies to all of them for the very brief bios, so we can have more time for our program. Since we have four panelists today, we decided to extend our usual 60-minute format to 75 minutes to hopefully get to all the things that we want to cover here today. Here's the way that things are going to go. There are no prepared presentations. There's no PowerPoint presentations today. This is going to be a very interactive program. I have questions I'm going to pose to all of the panelists, but we really want you guys, our participants, to pepper our panel with as many questions as you can. Pose them in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar platform, and I'll pose those to our speakers as we go along. And we'll try to make this as interactive as possible, both between myself and the speakers, between and amongst themselves, and with all of you. And we'll try to get to all of your questions here today. But first, some brief introductions in no particular order. First, Indira Hennard is the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. She's been with the center for the last 13 years, serving in different capacities and lending invaluable experience, including leadership roles in fundraising, operations, cultivating relationships, strategic partnerships, and coalition building. Under her leadership, she's not only repositioned the oldest rape crisis center in the country, but has laid a strong foundation as the agency prepares to celebrate 50 years of survivor-centered community-led services. Jen McCahill is a partner with GRF CPAs and Advisors, whose practice and expertise is concentrated in auditing, accounting, and financial management for nonprofit tax-exempt organizations. She is a frequent speaker on nonprofit-related financial topics such as common financial challenges, industry trends, accounting best practices, and compliance with the uniform guidance for federal grant and cooperative agreement recipients. Misty Osterhout is currently the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Finance Officer of the American Traffic Safety Services Association. With over 23 years of experience in the nonprofit industry, she has strategically led finance, operations, marketing, and communications teams through economic and cultural transitions. She was instrumental in ATS's growth from $2 million to $12 million in annual revenue, leads the campaign for National Work Zone Awareness Week, and continues to engage board members and volunteers in strategically growing and strengthening the association. And finally, last but not least, Glenn Devenish is a manager in the DC office of your part-time controller. His career started in public accounting back when the earth was flat and his hair didn't blend so nicely into his Zoom background. After spending many years working for corporations, Glenn has had the privilege of using his financial, accounting, and operational experience to help his clients achieve their mission and that of YPTC, which is to build stronger nonprofits. Thanks to all of you for your participation here today. And we purposely selected this panel to have two folks, Jen and Glenn, who work extensively with a wide variety of nonprofit organizations and can share all of those perspectives. And then two of our panelists, Indira and Mitzi, who work in-house, one at a charitable organization, the DC Rape Crisis Center, and the other at a trade association, ATSA, which is Mitzi, to lend their kind of in-house experiences with all of you here today. So with that as background, I'm going to kick things off and get started. And as I've talked to the panelists about, after I pose a question to someone, if anyone else has something they'd like to add on, some color commentary, war stories, or other things like that, please feel free to do so. So start off with Jen. Jen, as an auditor, what's your role in reviewing the budget for your nonprofit clients, and what are the key things you look for, especially in volatile years like we've certainly had over the last year plus?
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate you and everyone being on the webinar today. So we're kicking it off right away with a third-party perspective. I know Jeff mentioned we have two in-house and Glenn and I being external. One of the things we say as the external auditor, especially when it comes to budget. So obviously our job is to verify the financial statements as it actually occurred at the end of the year. But one of the great things we like to take a look at when we're doing our audits from an external point of view is not only your year-end budget to actual, but your subsequent year's budget, and then that internal reporting that's occurring during the budget process and the budget review throughout the year. So one of the first things I'll always do is obtain the budget to actual for the entire year and look for anything that's just completely out of line. Right. So you budgeted X amount and you're significantly over or under, why? As an external auditor, we're there once a year. So we don't have all of the background and the ongoing conversations that maybe you and your board have strategically decided on. So anything that's big variances really jump out at us and can lend to maybe where further risks lie. So that's definitely one thing we're looking at. We're also looking at subsequent to year end, your budget for next year. What does that look like and what story does that tell as far as a risk perspective or something that's going to occur subsequent from an audit perspective that could potentially lend to risk evaluation in the year that we're doing the audit, or things that need to be disclosed within the financial process. So in a year like 2020, when budgets were all over the place, when people thought their normal revenues were going to occur and, not a single budget aligned with what they thought they were going to at the beginning of 2020, that kind of throws us off, but it goes to communications. Partway through the year in 2020, we then saw everyone redo their budget, right? So April, everyone's coming up with an amended version of the budget. I think for the most part, everyone did a great job at having those discussions with their board saying, listen, this isn't a year that we could anticipate or we could have anticipated. So again, for us, that kind of segues into where the underlying risks are. Well, huge operating losses, what do we need to look for as an external auditor as far as revenue recognition and potential for manipulation of revenue in a year that you might have not anticipated such a strong loss. So those are some of the things that we look for. The only other thing I'll say is, as an auditor, if those conversations are being had and we can't see that the board is reviewing the budget or having those conversations, I did have, unfortunately, a couple clients that, didn't have that communication with their governance from the governance perspective, saying, we're not going to land where we are. There's very disengaged board. That's also a red flag for the external auditor. So if I don't see those things occurring throughout the year, I'm going to reassess my risk and where I think I need to do some more testing and digging and have those conversations to ensure there's nothing funny going on there. Yeah, funny is a technical accounting term, so I'll turn it back.
Thank you, Jen. So kind of keying off of that, Indira, what are some good strategies that you've developed in working with your board of directors on budgeting issues? And what's your number one rule for how you engage with your board on budgeting issues?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's great to be with everyone. For me, the number one thing that I've done since coming on board as ED is cultivate a relationship with the board, which I think is really, really important. One of the things that we do great is that we have a strong communication between myself and my board chair. So I'm always updating my board in between board meetings. So by the time the board meeting comes, there's no surprise. If there are some things coming down the pike that I think is going to impact the budget, whether in a good way or a bad way, I'll have a conversation with my board chair about that. If there are some other kind of big projects that we're working on, for example, our 50th anniversary is coming up starting in January 1st, 2022. It's going to be a big year for us. And so in calculating our budget for FY22, we've put those expenses in there. So I think for me, it's really having conversations on the front end versus the back end. But what I will also say is I'm also having conversations with my financial team, right? So always checking in and making sure that I'm not overspending line items, or if there's any concerns they have, or, as we just wrapped up our fiscal year, having a big powwow with the finance team to see where we are and, is there anything I need to be, worried about or that we need to email Jen about in advance, right? Before she comes in early next year. So I think for me, communication is really the name of the game.
That's great. Glenn, again, keying off the same topic, and I know you work with quite a number of nonprofit clients. What lessons did you and your clients learn from budgeting during a pandemic?
So similarly, I'm happy to be here, and thanks everybody for showing up. So yeah, I think the pandemic just highlighted a couple of things that are actually true every year, right? So having reserves is important. Having reserves is not something that you build overnight. Typically, that takes organizations years, but it does give you the flexibility to manage through the ups and downs. And certainly, the pandemic's a bit of an extreme, but even there, it can allow you some flexibility. So, as an example, I had a client that had some reserves, and going into the pandemic, they took the unprecedented move of actually lowering their dues. And because they had the reserves on hand, they were able to do this. And the messaging that they sent to their members was, we're in this with you. We want to help you in any way we can. So they lowered the dues. A lot of the members were smaller organizations, so it was much appreciated. And it was well received by just virtually everybody. So having reserves is important. At the same time, demonstrating value. The pandemic really forced everybody to adapt and to pretty much move to a virtual environment, and that became critical. But besides just holding meetings virtually and doing the same things in a different way, I had clients that increased the frequency of their webinars. They provided varying and relevant topics for people to log into, and they increased their presence online and the messaging that they had. Which they adapted very well to the environment. The other thing is, if there's information or things that you're typically giving your members, take a look at that and see, is the information I'm providing relevant? So another example there is I have a client that historically provided their members a survey, a revenue survey. So it was always a look backwards at the previous year and kind of gave everybody an update as to how their peers were doing and where the revenue was coming from, that kind of thing. But with the pandemic hitting, they went ahead and added some questions looking forward, asking people, hey, what's your forecast for the upcoming year? What's your forecast going into 2021? How are you reacting to the pandemic? What actions are you taking? Those kinds of things. And even though the information previously was very relevant to everyone, it was even more so this year. And in a pandemic year, it was timely. It was, market data from their peers. So it was very relevant to everyone involved. So always should be looking at how are you demonstrating value to your members or anyone else that you're dealing with.
Thanks, Glenn. And Mitzi, when ATSA was planning for 2021, you knew in advance that you were not going to be able to hold your annual convention and expo in person, which is a major source of revenue for your association. How did you lead your association in creating a strategic operational plan for this year?
Hi, thanks, Jeff. Yes, so 2021 was hard to plan for. ATSA got really lucky in 2020. Our expo was in February. So 2020, we had our expo. It nets about $1.5 million, $1.5 to $2 million. So it's a big chunk to be missing from your budget. So for 2021, we needed to figure out how we can still provide value to our members, how we can keep our programs and services and be relevant for them without this big chunk of revenue. So we did a couple of things. First of all, it is the first time that I've ever gone to a board of directors with a budget that proposed a loss. And it didn't surprise them, as Indira has mentioned, communications with the budget committee was imperative. So it didn't surprise them. And we budgeted for a virtual expo. We increased our estimations of sponsorships so that we could get more revenue that way. But we still had this loss. So we talked with the budget committee and said, okay, first of all, is it short-term or long-term? We all agreed it would be a short-term situation. We agreed that reserve funds could be used if needed, that this would qualify, according to our policy. But then we looked at the budget and said, we really would like to balance this. And so we used designated funds. We used board designated funds rather extensively. So for a board designated fund, you can set these up for expenses that are not a normal part of your operations and that are a significant cost. So we took a look at some of the designated funds that we had in place and said, do we need that much? And we ended up decreasing some of our board designated funds in order to create a COVID relief designated fund that could cover some of the costs of the virtual expo. So we managed to balance our budget that way. We did have to go back and amend the budget because our optimistic budgeting for sponsorships didn't really come through all the way. So we did amend the budget. Fortunately, we had PPP and the ERTC, the Employee Retention Tax Credit, to help offset some of that. But I think that the creativity with the designated funds has been very helpful to ATSA.
Thanks, Mitzi. There's a question both for Jen and Glenn. I'll turn it to Jen first. Since both of you work with so many different nonprofit clients, what do you see as some of the keys to success in the budgeting process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a number of us have mentioned communication so far. I think that is by far, the thing that we see from an external perspective looking in, when we see a successful budgeting process and maybe an unsuccessful, there's always an either good line of communication or a breakdown in communication. And since we work with so many clients, it's very easy to see what is occurring that's prohibitive of a good communication and budgeting process. So the other thing I'll say for communication, we've talked a lot about external to the board, to governance, because ultimately that is who you as an organization are reporting to, who has the fiduciary responsibility for oversight of the organization's financial resources. But we haven't talked about internal communications either. I know we have a lot of organizations here that range in size, But what I see most often in a breakdown of budgeting process from a very large organization is that they're not pulling all the various players into the budgeting process. Whether that's departments, whether that's program leads, you know, other players in the C-suite. That we have this whole finance team over here that's responsible for budgeting for an organization that has 10 different departments, and there's no internal communication with those departments. If you're heavily federally funded, I've seen some organizations take that same approach. It's all housed in the finance department, but the finance people aren't actually the ones implementing the programmatic activities on the various grants. And so what you get is a very big disconnect of what is actually happening and what the finance team thought it should be from the proposed budgets on the grants. So a slight shift in looping in all different players internally, so that internal communication as well will lend to a much more precise budgeting process if that's not already occurring. So I've seen a number of instances where, you know, there are years after year of issues because that internal communication is not happening. So I'll just say that that's certainly one key to the budgeting process. I'm not sure if Glenn had anything else.
Glenn, you have a key to add?
Yeah, I kind of wish I'd gone first because.
Sorry, steal your answer.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. Yeah, for me, it's a couple things really, and it really ties in nicely with the communication theme. And that, you know, for me, for a successful budget, direction from leadership, right? So the executive director, your senior team, the board of directors, they're really responsible for providing that framework for the upcoming budget and giving the guidelines as to, you know, where we think things are going. Part of that is doing the homework, understanding the environment ahead of you and the potential impact from the revenue, whether it's the economy, the government, industry data, you know, helping to create that framework. And then the second thing, as Jen just said, you know, involvement throughout the organization, right? You're not going to include every person in the organization in the budget process, but certainly the managers and the supervisors who've got to execute on that budget should be involved. And similarly, if you're going to get their buy-in and ownership in those numbers, if you're going to hold them accountable, they've got to have a say in what the numbers are when they're being created, so they know what they're doing going after them.
Yeah, Glenn, and just to piggyback off what you said, it's the accountability piece after the fact as well. It's not just the budgeting up front, it's they own their budget to actual throughout the year. And I think that's a key component.
Thank you. By the way, I misspoke earlier when I told everyone to put your questions in the chat box. The chat box is disabled on this webinar, so put them in the Q&A box if that wasn't apparent, if and when you have questions. Indira, so what is your number one rule for how you manage your organization's finances?
Oh, great question. So I think for me, because we are a 24/7 direct service organization and we have still been operating full blown throughout the pandemic, one of the things I have to do is plan for the unintended consequences. And I have to be able to anticipate. And so particularly throughout this last year and a half, as a result of the pandemic, there were a lot of expenses that we didn't anticipate for. And so I had to, one, beg for more money from funders, or reshift some things in our budget. So for me, I'm always looking at the risk in terms of what I may have to do on a financial level. We also own our building. So that's the other factor I have to keep in mind. But one of the main ingredients that I try to do is when I'm planning a budget, I do a draft. And the first draft is normally a conservative draft. And then I send it to my finance team for them to take a look at. And then we come together to finalize the budget in detail that I'm going to present to the board of directors. So it's a very collaborative approach, even with my managers. I get their input. They submit what I call their Christmas list of, you know, things that they want, right? I call it the Hollywood budget. And then we have a conversation on, what's going to be realistic from that Hollywood Christmas budget. And then we come to terms. So for us, as we're building out new programs, we're planning for the 50th, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. Us having a reserve has been critical, but also going back to funders saying, look, this is what I'm needing in order to execute these services in the midst of a global pandemic. So that's also really been critical for us. And then also being able to have a cushion and what I call a just in case / reserve fund in case, something comes out of the blue that we have to take care of, which tends to happen when you own your own building, like plumbing issues, and still maintaining a building in the midst of a pandemic, even though you weren't in the building. So that's also been critical. And I think for nonprofits, because a lot of my colleagues struggled with their boards on getting approval for the PP loans, because a lot of boards really didn't understand it. I was lucky enough that my boards got it. And so they were able to approve me applying for it. And so we were able to apply for the PP loans, and we got them forgiven, which means we did everything right. So yeah.
Exactly. So following up on one thing you just mentioned about reserves, any suggestions for how you go about building a reserve for your organization?
Yeah, so for me, I apply for a lot of, I diversify our funding streams, right? And a lot of the money I apply for is unrestricted, but we also do fundraising, right? So it's really, I manage our budget very tightly, and I'm very keen on what we spend and how we're spending. Like, I'm always looking for deals or bargains, or kind of doing 3 rural procurement kind of proposals. So in terms of the reserves, I came on when I came on as ED, I was very clear that I wanted us to have kind of an emergency fund just in case. And so as we were able to diversify funding from individual donors and other types of funding source, I was able to steer some of that money to our reserves. So I really encourage people to diversify the funding stream, and really, try to put some aside if possible, and then steady build off of that so that you have a good 6 to 8 months of, reserves that can kind of support you in challenging times.
Great, thank you very much. Mitzi, so with all of this uncertainty, what are some techniques that you and ATSA are using to lead your association into the development of a financially solid business plan for 2022?
Thank you, Jeff. So 2022, it's going to be a tough year for a lot of people, or for a lot of trade associations, especially if they have a trade show that's a big part of their revenue. I already mentioned how important it is to ATSA's budget. So as we looked at 2022, I had staff prepare best case and worst case scenario budgets. And our best case, we got it to break even. Our worst case has a loss of about $4 million. Now, I can never take that to my board, or I'd be looking for a different job. But we did go to the board of, the budget committee. They met last week. So we had a lot of communications before the meeting, and I talked with them all and said, hey, this is our best case scenario. We don't know for sure what Expo will look like. Our Expo happens in January or February. Next year it'll be in February. So another big portion of our revenue is training courses. We offer in-person training courses, and it's about 60% of our revenue. So with this Delta variant coming out with COVID, there's a lot of uncertainty for us. So we went to the group and said, this is our best case scenario. Give us the first quarter. Give us the first quarter, And I guarantee you we'll come back with an amended budget after that, but we'll have a much better idea. Several years ago, one of the changes that I made at ATSA was to change our fiscal year. And I put the majority of our revenue happening at the beginning of the year. So that way, if something doesn't happen, or if there's a big uncertainty like next year will be, then we can catch it at the beginning of the year and make changes accordingly. Another technique that I used in our budgeting is we call it a reserve for revenue shortfall. So reserve for revenue shortfall is a contra revenue account, and we use it as a managerial tool. So as we have directors that are putting in their best case scenario budgets, they're putting in their stretch goals. You don't want to sell the farm based on that, right? You can't budget all the expenses for that much revenue. So we'll put in a contra revenue account, it just decreases revenue. It's a good management tool because it lets people budget their stretch goals, and it protects your bottom line a little bit because okay, we budgeted for training revenue to increase by 10% from where it was in 2019. And in 2019, we had our best year of training revenue in our history, and we're budgeting for an increase. Now, we had a lot of discussion with the budget committee about it, and asked, every single person on the committee talked about training, and their general consensus was that they think there's a strong possibility there will be an increase, that there's going to be a backlog from training that didn't happen during the pandemic. Our training is required by many states, by many departments of transportation for people in work zones on the roadways. So as we move forward, certifications are expiring. They said, I think there will be a backlog. I think you will see an uptick. Go ahead and budget it, and we'll be back again after first quarter. So that's kind of part of the way that we are able to still budget and make plans to be expanding some of our programs and providing members with some of the services they need. Our members are going to need a lot of services next year with the material shortfall. They really need us to be representing them and advocating for them, which costs a lot of money.
Great. As we know, coming into 2021, vaccines come online early in the year, and everyone's, especially trade and professional associations that hold a lot of meetings and conferences and in-person trainings and educational events and things like that. So many folks, associations thought, and other nonprofits that hold events and in-person gatherings, that as we got further into 2021, everything was going to kind of start to get back to normal and would be able to hold all these things. A lot of the conferences from 2020 were pushed back. We helped hundreds of associations do that into 2021. And now every day we're dealing with associations. My firm and my colleagues and I are dealing with associations that are now concerned about holding in-person conferences in 2021 because of how the Delta variant really threw a monkey wrench into everything. And I'm sure it threw a monkey wrench into all of your budgeting. And looking into next year, again, just like we were a year ago, I think most people hope and think that the pandemic will largely be in the rearview mirror by then. And like you said, in-person trainings will maybe even be booming for you, but we just don't know. And that's what this is all about. There's just so much uncertainty. So Jen, for associates, what's the biggest trend you're seeing in budgeted revenues for this year and for 2022?
Yeah, it is complete uncertainty. It really is, because 2020, once we realized what was going on, everyone said, okay, we can't have in-person events. We're going to budget for 2021 in-person events. We'll be back to normal by then. Well, we keep rolling on, and people just come to the realization that we don't know. And so it's almost like this year and 2022 is more uncertainty than it was last year, because we at least thought that there would be an end in sight. So obviously, for associations, the biggest thing that we see is the cancellation of the in-person events. And, a lot of associations do book those events years in advance, 5 years, and have entered into contracts. And so while some of my organizations were able to get out of those contracts in year one, year two, moving forward, that is just, it's not going to be an option anymore. The vendors have wised up and removed any clauses. And Jeff, maybe you can speak to that. I'm sure you look at a lot of that in the contract side. But certainly, I see that there's going to be increased costs for potential cancellation of events that have been booked years in advance, potential continued lost revenues in in-person events, still trying to figure out the virtual. And then some organizations for the membership base, it really is a potential decline there because it's portraying value in a time of uncertainty. I know Mitzi and Glenn have mentioned value and how to communicate that on the membership side a number of times, because I think even prior to the pandemic, membership, organizations were really trying to figure out how to portray that value on an ongoing basis to their clients. So I see a lot of that going on. And I know you asked on the association side, but on the kind of charitable giving side and the charity organizations, 2020 was a surprising year in that a lot of organizations did great, if not better than they had planned in 2020 because of the pandemic. Foundations didn't pull back money. As a matter of fact, a lot just switched and said, use this for unrestricted purposes or whatever you need to sustain operations during this time. So we saw, a surprising kind of trend in 2020 that we anticipate there's no reason we would foresee government funding falling or pulling back. So those that are heavily federally funded or government funded, there's no lack of available funds, especially with the increase in all of the CARES Act funding out there to continue and sustain operations there. So it's a different story on the C3 side than it really is on the C6 side, because it's almost like an opposite effect that COVID had on a lot of those charitable organizations versus the associations.
Yeah, and just to close the loop on kind of the association meeting and conference front, first off, in 2020, we probably worked on 700 plus different conferences, and we were able to get virtually all of those associations out of those contracts using various tools and techniques without paying any or virtually no cancellation penalties, particularly relying heavily on the force majeure clauses in those meeting contracts, because so many states and cities and counties had bans on large gatherings, which made it impossible or illegal to hold the events. That's not the case in 2021. Virtually all of those bans across the country have gone away. It's virtually impossible to get an association out of the contract completely without cancellation penalties based on force majeure. And so as a result, if you don't want to pay a lot in cancellation penalties, they're always negotiable, but you're not going to get out penalty free without paying a pretty heavy price, either in doing multiple year rebooks or other things like that. So as a result, while a lot of them don't want to, many associations have been forced to go ahead and hold in-person or plan to hold in-person conferences. And a lot of them have, particularly through the summer and the fall and beyond in 2021. But in virtually every case, it's with significantly reduced attendance, and therefore potentially significant attrition penalties for failing to meet your guaranteed minimums in the contracts for sleeping room revenue and food and beverage revenue. And that creates a lot of uncertainty. And I think that is what is going to be with us into 2022. By all accounts and all surveys and other things, and just talking to our clients about this, that most associations are planning to go ahead, would like to plan to go ahead with in-person events and in-person trainings and other things, but there's still so much hesitancy, amongst so many segments of the public to attend larger gatherings and whatnot and go to in-person things, that there's just tremendous uncertainty with attrition penalties, with reduced revenues and other things. And that obviously throws a huge monkey wrench into the budgeting process. Glenn, what can nonprofit organizations do to get the most from their budget?
Yeah, before I go there, I just want to kind of, piggyback on what you guys have said.
Sure.
We deal with a lot of C3s, and I know I've got, specific cases of clients that are wanting to do the in-person, just like you said. That's where they got the most revenue. They like that format, but there is hesitancy. And in addition, they're thinking of ways to make it a hybrid situation. For those that are uncertain about attending, they want to give them an option as well by making it virtual in some way. So, from my standpoint, seeing a lot of similar activity as you guys have described. Going to the question about getting the most out of, I've already lost my train of thought.
Getting the most out of your budget.
Yeah, I think a lot of things that both Mitzi and Indira have mentioned already, are really critical. Putting in the work up front is something. The budget process is never fun. It's tedious. It can take a long time, but as Indira mentioned, understanding your revenue streams, identifying the sources and talking through those action plans with your development team or whoever is in charge of revenue, making sure that what are the probabilities of us getting this again this year, or is there someplace else that we can go to get that is really important. And along the same vein, understanding your expenses. Right? Don't take for granted that expenses are going to cost the same from year to year, especially if you're in an inflationary environment like we're kind of in now. Understanding what your cost structure is and all of that's very important. I mean, for the vast majority of nonprofits, people is your biggest expense. So, asking the questions, do I have the right people in place to execute the budget? Do I have enough staff? What's that going to cost me, not only to add people, but also to retain staff? Those things are all very important. So putting in that effort up front is really important. And then, doing sensitivities or scenario planning, which was mentioned earlier, doing here's the high end, here's the low end, or even some, a few scenarios in between is important because, going through that exercise and thinking through what you're going to need to do at different levels of revenue is really going to help you out when the inevitable twists and turns come. I think you're going to end up being more agile and better able to react to those situations, maybe not be in as much of a panic if you've thought through that, talked through that with your staff, and also even with your board as well. So I think taking those approaches can really help organizations get the most out of their budget.
Thanks, Glenn. We have a question from one of our participants, keying off something that you just said, and we hear this all the time from our association clients. Will hybrid programs cost even more than either in-person events or virtual events alone, so that the net revenue might be even less? And I've heard this from countless clients that have tried kind of the hybrid approach, and they say it's difficult, it's expensive. Mm-hmm. Look, some of our clients went solely virtual and did really well. Generally, you're not going to be able to charge as much, but they got a lot higher number of participants because it's easier for people don't have to take the expense and the time to get there. It's been a mixed bag from what I've seen, but almost across the board, I've heard from so many clients about how difficult and expensive hybrid programs can cost. Glenn or Jen or Mitzi, do you have any insight experience with this? Any thoughts on this question?
The answer is yes, you're correct. Yes, they are more expensive. But the only thing I'll say to that is, organizations that do a lot of events, if you're making an investment in something that you can potentially, so for example, I'm on the board of an organization where we do fundraising, and we made an investment and we purchased a tent to do a hybrid outdoor-indoor event, socially distant, and it was expensive. But we purchased it knowing that we're going to use it for multiple events, hybrid events over the next 2 years. So yes, in that instance, that one event netted less, but we anticipate being able to leverage that one-time investment over a number of programming that will continue over the next couple of years. So I would say, look at it from a perspective of, can you leverage any of that into future events? But yes, they're generally more expensive.
If I can just add a little bit on the end of that, as we are getting ready for our expo in February, we talked with a hotel about some of the costs that would be involved if we did a hybrid event, and we're seeing hotel costs increase significantly for AV, for Wi-Fi in rooms. the cost was so high that it's prohibitive. So we'll record some of our educational sessions and make them available, but we are not planning a hybrid event.
Yeah, what everybody said is correct. I mean, I think Jen brought up a good point. You really do have to, if that's something that you're anticipating doing in the long term, then certainly the investment, it's an investment at that point. But if this is something you're just venturing out on into for the first time or maybe the second time, yeah, it's going to be very expensive because you're dealing with a meeting that's on two platforms, right? You're going to be paying for not only the hotel costs and the physical cost of people being there, but as Mitzi said, the internet connection, all the video. I mean, the hotels gouged you before the pandemic, and there's no way they're going back, now. So yeah, it is a very costly thing. But if it's something long term that you're going to anticipate doing more frequently, some of those elements being an investment make some sense.
Thank you. All right, Indira, we haven't heard from you in a bit. Let me pose a question to you. So what are some of the best practices that you've learned for budgeting during the pandemic, and how do you plan for the unintended consequences of this?
Yeah, so this was the first time in 49 years that my agency moved to remote services. All of our services were remote. So we had to plan for technology. We had to bridge the digital divide between clients who didn't have laptops. We had to make sure all of our staff had laptops. We had to pay for Zoom accounts. And, just all of those things that you don't think about. And so for me, part of the way that I planned is that a lot of our private funders in DC had special COVID relief funding that we could apply for that also helped with those costs. Some of our funders allowed us to move some things around in our budget in order to plan for the unintended consequences of COVID. So that also helped a lot. So I think for me, what I did was when we first went remotely was really do a survey of our clients to find out, were they going to be able to go on a virtual platform without disrupting their mental health services. So some needed laptops, some needed Wi-Fi, some needed to learn how to use the platforms. And so once I got those figures, then that enabled me to figure out what those costs were so that I could go to the funders to say, hey, this is what I would be needing. And then the cost of maintaining a building that we weren't in. Right. So part of what I did was reduce some of our services, understanding that we weren't going to be in. Right. So I don't have to have a high copy bill anymore, because we weren't in the building. Right. We didn't have to do the cleaning as frequently as we did because we weren't in the building. Right. So we were able to reduce some of our vendor expenses because we weren't in. Now, folks are coming back. And so, those expenses are, kind of back in action. But I think, again, as we don't know what's happening around the corner, we don't know what the next 6 to 8 months are going to be. If we have to pivot back quickly, I'm still planning and putting things in the budget for the pandemic, right? So even for our programs that are in the community, we had to get PPE equipment, right? But I was able to partner with Care First to send me thousands of PPE equipment for our advocates in the hospital. So I think for me, going back to the funders was a key strategy. Applying for the COVID funding was another key strategy. Reaching out to other partners to get things that I didn't have to pay for, like Care First.
Excellent. So this is a question.
Jeff, can I piggyback off something Indira started to talk about? So she mentioned one of the key things she also did was look at, on the expense side, what she could reduce. And we talked a lot about building reserves in budgeting, and how key it is in times, in the years of uncertainty, to be able to pull on those reserves. But one of the things I also see as a key kind of item within the budgeting process that surprisingly sometimes organizations miss is being able to pivot when you do recognize there is a shortfall or multi-years of revenue, that you then need to reduce those expenses. So I oftentimes, as an auditor, when I'm looking and I see multiple years of recurring losses, and I say, okay, are these plan losses? Was there an investment in infrastructure, or was there new programming that you knew was going to take funds to start up? If yes, okay, I can see that in communication with the board. If not, organizations need to build in on the expense side as well, reductions in expenses if additional revenues can't be obtained, or again, these are communications with the board that you ultimately have approved a loss this year and next year, and then we would anticipate, going back to kind of our normal state. So there's so many times I walk into an organization and there's a huge disconnect between governance and what they thought they were going to have, and why do we have these huge losses? And, we weren't agile throughout the year to do something about it when we needed to. And sometimes organizations are too late for that. So that's something also to keep in mind.
That's a great tip. Glenn, as we head into 2022, what are some positive trends you're seeing with your clients?
So this is going to be somewhat contrary, but mainly because of the type of organizations that we tend to deal with on the 501c3. So, revenue, I think Jen touched on this earlier. 2020 there were certainly organizations and industries that got hammered by the pandemic, and we've seen that in the press, but there were organizations that actually ended up not being too bad considering, the expectations going into the pandemic. So their 2020 ended up being a little bit better or a lot better than they anticipated, and that kind of moved on into 2021, that the revenue was ticking up. Some of that's going to be due to the revenue recognition on the PPPL loans or PPP loans that were forgiven. Some of that's going to fall into this year and help that number. But moving into 2022, I think the trend for revenues is expectation that's going to increase. There were foundations, individual giving that went along with all the governmental solutions that helped folks increase their revenue. So I think that's going to continue. One piece of anecdotal evidence, so to speak, is going back to the revenue survey I talked about earlier. That was an annual survey, and when we did the survey in June of 2020, one of the questions that was asked was, when do you think you're going to recover the lost revenue, if ever? And so, of the respondents, 55% of them said, hey, it's going to take us at least 3 years. And in some cases, we're never going to be able to recover. Fast forward a year, and we asked the same question for 2021, and that number dropped to around 10%. So clearly folks had a better experience in 2020 than they anticipated going through. And so I just, 2021 is better. And I think 2022 for many organizations is going to continue an upward trend. The other thing, as much as we just kind of bashed it a little bit, was there are organizations that are going back to an in-person environment. I don't think we're ever going to get away from a virtual environment and virtual presentations and webinars, but there are some that have to go back to the in-person events. They want to do that. And I just think, although it may be a while, that's just a positive trend moving forward for different organizations.
You're exactly right. So not to be a downer, those are some of the positives that you're looking forward to for where your clients are for 2022. But what are some of the headwinds that you're seeing for next year with your clients?
It's the same thing that I think everybody's reading about in the press. First of all, it's going to be staffing. Whether you're trying to hire and add people or whether you're trying to retain folks, it's going to be a challenge moving forward. I mean, we've all heard about the Great Resignation and what that's done, but I'm working with clients to help them staff up their accounting and finance departments, and we're involved in the interview process, and that's a challenge. I mean, you can certainly get a warm body to fill a seat, but I don't think that's what people are looking for. To hire a quality person, it's taking time to find those. I had a client earlier this year that came to me and said, hey, we just had one of our staff leave, can you fill the spot? And it was a staff accounting role, so it wasn't very senior, and certainly we were there to help. So we put someone in. They anticipated it was going to take them 2 to 3 months. It wasn't until August that they were able to fill that role. And as a shameless plug, they're going to keep us on for a little while longer through the end of the year. But that's kind of indicative of what I'm seeing still as I'm helping clients interview, and certainly for us as an organization, as we're hiring, finding folks, it's taking longer. So no one should have the attitude that I can fill that seat or I can fill that role quickly. Certainly in 2021, and I can't imagine that improving too much in 2022. The other thing is just the inflationary impact. We're all feeling it personally, and whether it's a short-term thing or a long-term thing, we can let the economists kind of duke that out. But that's another thing. That's going to impact budgets. It's going to eat more of your revenue. So don't, as I said earlier, don't expect things that you paid for last year to cost the same. And for organizations that are moving more towards having folks, in the office, the coffee that you bought 2 years ago and the water and the Post-it notes and things like that, that's all going up. So definitely keep those in consideration as you're developing your budgets for the coming year.
Yeah, and it's across the board. It's not just products and services. It's things like insurance. Insurance premiums seem to be up generally around 30%. And that's been a trend for a while. The pandemic made it worse. The inflationary pressures make it worse. But 30% increase in your insurance premiums, if you have a pretty extensive insurance portfolio and across the board, that's a lot. Jen, why don't I let you kind of piggyback on that? Because I'm sure you and Glenn both have kind of big outsourcing practices in your firms, which I have no doubt are booming. Outsourced finance and accounting work. But why don't you comment on those issues as well? In terms of
Glenn nailed it. As far as every organization, people are the largest expense. Your people and probably your office space are your largest expense, and two of the things significantly impacted by the pandemic, and then ultimately the shortage of staffing. One thing that Glenn mentioned on his C3 basis when he's talking about how 2020 ended up being a really good year and we're foreseeing 21 to be generally a good year too. The markets are up still too. A lot of that 2020 performance when the markets crashed in March, they came right back by the end of the year. So any organization that held investments, when you're looking at being able to capitalize or pull down on some of those returns that you held in the investment portfolio, that has continued all the way through 21. So organizations are really fortunate, the ones that have that investment portfolios, to be able to pull down or even, fundamentally show some of that unrealized activity. And who knows where it continues to perform strong. So, will that continue all the way through 2022? I don't know, but if I did, I wouldn't be giving a budgeting webinar. I'd be on the beach somewhere, but nonetheless, we think it'll be a good year for C3s as well. We don't foresee anything at the end of the year, charitable giving that is going to be significantly different than last year.
Do you want to speak to that? Any kind of foresight, insight, things to consider or note for 2021 year-end charitable giving?
No, same thing that Glenn mentioned. The government funding is plentiful right now, whether it's federal or state level. All that CARES Act funding at the states, they are distributing that. The federal government, there's no reason for them to pull back. It's same with the foundations. Again, a lot of these private foundations that have those huge investment portfolios are performing very well. So they need to distribute a certain amount of those. So, we anticipate strong C3 giving, and then just personal giving, as long as your investments and stocks are doing well, we wouldn't anticipate any changes from 2020.
Mitzi, in your association, what are you seeing from your fundraising efforts, and are you trying anything different recently?
Sure, thanks. We have a charitable foundation. Also, we have a 501c3, and I found it kind of interesting in that individual donations have stayed about kind of steady. But what we've seen is some of the owners of businesses who are concerned about our foundation trying some different fundraising techniques to benefit the foundation. And what I'm seeing with it is competitions. So they've started holding auctions. So if you've seen some of these construction crews on the roads, they have like big trucks that put the stripes down on the roads. Okay, well, they auction off something like that. and they have their marketing and sales team go out and talk to all their vendors to get them to place a bid to buy this truck. And they sell the truck for a lot more than they would normally and donate all the proceeds to the foundation. We've also seen our chapters have competitions amongst themselves to hold fundraisers for the foundation. And they have this competition to see who can make the most money. And I find it interesting because they miss each other. They miss being around each other. And I think these competitions are a way for them to just interact with each other. I see that continuing as we move forward.
Interesting. Okay, so I have kind of a final question that I'm going to pose to all of our panelists, and this should kind of form the basis for the rest of our discussion, along with any other questions that you guys in the audience might have. So I'll start with Indira. Indira, are there changes that were forced on your organization by the pandemic that you actually like and plan to continue post-pandemic?
Such a great question. So actually, one of the main changes that we like that we're going to keep moving forward is not just offering our clients our regular in-person services, but we're going to keep a hybrid model, right? And we're going to keep that hybrid model because we know that some folks are really struggling to come back indoors. And, because one of the things I said is that as a mental health expert, we have not begun to see the long-term mental health impact that the pandemic has had on individuals. And so some of our clients have said, Indira, I just can't come back to the building. Whether it's due to their depression, not wanting to ride metro, whatever that is. And so I'm going to offer a hybrid model that, some clients want to come back and some clients don't. So I think for us, the hybrid virtual is to stay, but we're still going to do in person as well. So I think in the long run, that's going to be really good because it gives our clients the flexibility to not have their mental health services disrupted. And it also still allows us to pivot back quickly if we have to.
That's great. And of course, I know both your organizations and so many clients of Jen and Glenn's are dealing with the same issue on the employment front. Virtually every employer is. And I think most employers have recognized that some form of kind of hybrid remote work, probably mixed bag for a lot, some completely virtual. It's literally all over the place. And we counsel clients literally every day on these issues. There's a lot of sensitive legal issues involved in developing new and different remote work policies kind of post-pandemic, and then all related issues about vaccination requirements and exceptions and all of the rest. But the bottom line is it's hard to find a nonprofit anywhere that is not contemplating some sort of at least partial remote work situation going forward. And these are difficult. And all the hundreds of clients that we work with, every one of them, we work on these policies and we work on the forms and exemption applications and everything else, exemptions from vaccination requirements and things like that. Every single one of them is a little bit different in terms of the policies they're developing and the structure that they're developing. And it's something that I think everyone's going to continue to struggle with, but have to figure out a way to make it work. Jen, I'll pose the same question to you. Are there changes that were forced on your clients by the pandemic that they actually like and plan to continue post-pandemic? Do you have a couple of examples?
Yes. So I'm going to do a pretty obvious one, but it's the one that my clients, and I'm going to laugh because Indira's on this call, the clients that were very traditional paper-based, and let's say they wanted to write checks via paper because they liked that process, have now moved to an electronic expense bill pay system, which is relatively affordable for most nonprofits. But I had quite a few that were still holdouts with the paper checks that were then forced to go to virtual expense bill pay system, and they love it. They absolutely love it. And I know Indira's on and she loves it. She was one of the few. No, we had many, but that's something that I think a lot of organizations are going to continue to look for. Cloud-based processing, efficiencies in the electronic world. We don't want to be emailing back and forth. How can we streamline processes in the new virtual environment? And I think we're just now seeing what will be on the horizon as far as what organizations or companies come up with to streamline that financial management process, because people will continue to work in a hybrid virtual working model. So, expense bill pay is just one example, but I anticipate there'll be some very creative new organizations and systems and processes that capitalize on this and come up with some much easier ways to do things electronically.
Excellent. Mitzi, same question for you. Change is forced on your association by the pandemic that you like and plan to continue post-pandemic.
Right. Well, I will agree with the others that we will most likely be a hybrid workforce after this. I don't know that we will ever go back to a full 5 days in the office. I got to tell you, my budget committee, we used to meet at headquarters, and we would spend about 8 hours in meetings. That budget committee meeting done virtually, we get it done in 3.5 hours. So I'm going to be pushing for that one. We've also had good success with the departments of transportation, who the majority of them would not allow online training before the pandemic. And we had to really lobby state DOTs. We got 28 of them to accept virtual training, and we'll keep pushing along those lines.
Yeah, and look, even this webinar itself, you can call it virtual, not training, but education. I mean, I've probably done 150 virtual webinars in the last, 2 years, almost 2 years since we started the new firm. And I would never have done that many if they were in person. And that's what most of them were. There were webinars and whatnot in the past. Most of them didn't have a video component. That's a big change. But being able to reach so many people so easily, being able to record the sessions like we're doing today and then share it with others, we'll end up reaching a lot more people by sharing the recording with others and actually even participated today. I think these are all great things that come out of the pandemic, and from this program's all about budgeting. There are ways to monetize that. That the technology was there before, it just wasn't the norm. And so many of our clients, who do, let's say, professional certifications, and all the testing was in person, and they've pivoted to virtual training and things like that. I mean, virtual testing and whatnot, and able to reach a lot more people easily, much easier, and be able to monetize that. So last but not least, Glenn, I'll pose the same question to you about changes forced on your clients by the pandemic that they like and plan to continue post-pandemic.
Yeah, all the good stuff's already been taken.
Sorry to put you last.
Yeah, to go off of what Jen said, the bill pay system, what's great about that is the controls around it. I know from an audit standpoint, when the auditors come into our clients, all that's electronic. They have access to it. They can see it. We don't have to go through filing cabinets or, oh, I don't know where that piece of paper is or what have you. Meanwhile, the controls over who's approving what, that structure's in place. And so those kinds of things, that'll probably proliferate more as we move further into this. But for all the reasons everyone has said, the hybrid work environment, we're never going back to 5 days a week. The commute reduces that for people, increases the opportunity for productivity. I'm not going to say that it increases productivity necessarily, but certainly the opportunity is there because the time is there for people to take advantage of that and do more with work. And then obviously, some of our clients have gotten rid of their physical space altogether. So we're kind of required to go virtual, and they also don't have that expense anymore, and it provides a little more flexibility in their budget. So I really don't have anything else to add.
That's great. On the personal front, or professional front, we added a new lawyer to our team in April. She's in Chicago. Julie, she's absolutely outstanding. Prior to the pandemic, I don't think that when we were looking to hire a third lawyer that I would have thought of hiring someone outside of the Washington, D.C. area. But what we found is that it's seamless and it's so easy to do that work. And I know it's the same. Not every job lends itself to that, but so many jobs do, and it just enables you to expand your talent pool for recruiting and other things like that. And definitely some great silver linings that have come from the pandemic. Jen, finally, just to close out with you, since you are an auditor, and I mean, what sort of changes have you seen in the audit process since the pandemic began? I know auditors like you and others at your firm that I work a lot with, in the past, always heard of them being on site, at different client sites, for multiple days to do the annual audit of the external financial statements. What sort of changes have you seen in the audit process?
Yeah, so it's a lot more ensuring that we understand the systems and the controls that are occurring in the virtual environment, right? So for us as auditors, we like to look at a piece of paper, see that signature, the approval. But when that's being done in a third-party system that's housed in a third-party environment with, cyber data security implications, we're a lot more attuned and responsible for understanding the flow of information through the third party versus the organization. So the one thing, the auditors aren't technically doing any sort of cyber or data security analysis, but we've had to bring in those teams quite a bit in our audit process because so much is being done externally outside of the organization. So understanding what the organization has in place on their third-party risk review, right? If you outsource your payroll, if you outsource your bill pay, you outsource all of these different components of your organization, all of the controls and all of the risk is lying with them. What is the organization doing to ensure that they're reviewing the controls and those third-party systems are working the way they should, right? And so it's a whole different world in auditing because, so many organizations are no longer doing a lot of these processes in-house. And the audit becomes much more applicable. The cyber and the data security becomes much more applicable during the audit than it ever has before.
Excellent, thank you. We have one final question from the audience, so to speak. And it seems like it's probably a question from me, although Glenn, this is something you and I have talked about. When you have remote workers, when you have people working remotely from different states, say other than the state where your principal headquarters is or wherever you have established physical offices, the question is, does that not open you up to have to register in every state where you have a remote worker? The short answer is yes, it does open you up to that. And we're not talking one registration. We're talking multiple different types of registration. You have generally, whenever you have an employee who's working, on a permanent or semi-permanent basis from a different state, your nonprofit is supposed to qualify to do business as a foreign corporation in that state. That's an easy registration. But then there's so many other things. You're going to be, that employee is going to be subject to the employment laws of that state, not your own state. So that in some states, that's a big difference, which is one reason, for instance, that some of our clients who are allowing their employees to remote work, so you can remote work from any state except California. Because California has the most employee-friendly employment laws, and a lot of employers don't want to be subject to that. Like for just one example, in California, non-exempt employees are subject to overtime pay on a daily basis. So any time worked over 8 hours in a day is subject to time and a half overtime, whereas federally and in most other states, it's over 40 hours in a week. And there's lots of other things and it's lawful to say you can work anywhere except California if you want to do that. But wherever they're working, they're subject to those employment laws, they're subject to that state's unemployment compensation. There's all the kind of payroll tax registration and everything else that has to happen. I was talking to Glenn because some of our clients have said, a company that can help us with all of this stuff, because it's so much, it's overwhelming. And if we're going to allow, if we're going to have employees in, 15 different states across the country, that's a lot of extra work, especially getting it set up. Perhaps easier once you get it all set up, but there's a lot of additional burdens and costs and risks attached to that. You have to modify your employee handbook to make sure that it's, you're complying with all those laws, at least for the employees that are located in those states. So yes, there's great things that come from it, and allowing to expand your talent pool and give people flexibility and all of that. But there are some significant burdens that are imposed on the nonprofit employer. All right, we are at 3:15 Eastern time, so we're at the end of our program. I want to thank our terrific panel for an outstanding job. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you. I know everyone else did. Thank you very much for your time and participation today. Thank you, Donna and FAR, for your co-sponsorship of today's program. And the Nonprofit Advisory Board and FAR, on behalf of both organizations, I want to thank you all for participating, and be sure to keep an eye out for our next program. Donna, thanks again for doing this.
Thank you. It was great. Fantastic job, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.